All right, we're going to talk about finding percents mentally. This is something that is pretty easy to do. And to me, this is something you need to know how to do in real life. Okay. And that's why I'm taking the time to go over this with you, because this is how I do it. Okay. When you're looking for a percent mentally, use 10% because that's going to be the easiest way to do it. 10% of a number simply means 1/10. 1/10 of a number. So in other words, you can actually just divide a number by 10 in order to find 10%. So let's practice this. Okay, and feel free to pause at any time, try it, then see what it is. 10% of 300, well, 300 divided by 10 would be 30. 10% of 72. Dividing that by 10 would be like putting a decimal place in the middle of it. So that would be 7 2/10. 10% of 4, that's like taking that and moving the decimal one place over. So that's going to be 4/10. 10% of 250, again, that's like moving the decimal place one over. Okay, so that's going to be 25. 10% of 45 is 4 5/10. 10% of 10 is just 1. That's not too bad, right? So what about if you want to find 20%, 30%, 40%, and so on? Okay, you go to dinner and you get your bill and you want to tip 20%. Are you going to get that tip calculator out? No, you're going to do this mentally. Because if we know multiples of 10, since we can find 10%, then all we have to do is find 10% and then multiply. So, example is 20% is equal to 10 times what? 2. 30%, 10 times 3. 40%, 10 times 4. So, let's practice this. 20% of 70. Okay, well, I know that 20% is 10% times 2, right? So what's 10% of 70? 10% is 7. So 7 times 2 is 14. So 20% of 70 is 14. So if you go and you have a bill, you're eating at a restaurant and the bill is $70, then you would tip $14. Okay, 40% of 300. Well, that's 10% times 4. So what's 10% of 300? 30. So 30 times 4 is 120. Notice that 40% is close to 50%, right? Which is half. And half of 300 is 150. So that makes sense for 40% to be 120. Use that reasonableness to see if this makes sense or not. Okay, we're going to do 30% of 40. Okay, I know 30% is less than half, so I know it should be less than 20, right? Okay, so if I do this next one, I've got 30% is 10% times 3, right? So what's 10% of 40? 4. And then 4 times 3 is 12. Okay, what about 70% of 80? I'm just going to do this one since I'm on this side. 70% of 80, that's 10% times 7. So 10% of 80 is 8. And 8 times 7 is 56. And I know that I'm close I know I'm not completely off because 70% is more than half. So I knew it should have been bigger than half of 80. So I knew it should have been more than 40. Okay, over here on this other side, 20% of 75. Okay, that means I know that's 10% times 2. So 10% would be 7 5/10 times 2. And what's that equal? 15. All right, 60% of 60. That's 10% times 6. And I know that's going to be more than half, so I know it should be more than 30, right? Because 60% is more than 50%. So 60%, so 10% would be 6 times 6 is 36. And yep, 36 is more than half of 60. So yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, so now let's talk about what, well, I've already kind of mentioned it, 50%. Y'all, 50% is the easiest to find. This one you should be able to do like in your head without a problem. Because 50% is just half of a number. So you just have to divide a number by 2. That one's easy, squeezy, lemon peasy. 50% of 30. What's half of 30? 15. 50% of 62. Half of 62 is 31. 50% of 8. 4. 50% of 220. 110. Easy, right? Okay, so now 25%. That's the other one that's really easy, y'all. 25% is just 1/4 of a number. So you're just going to divide it by 4 to figure out what 25% of a number is. So if I have 25% of 40, that's just dividing 40 by 4. And what am I going to get? 10. 25% of 32, 8. Because that's 32, that's 1/4 of 32. It's 32 divided by 4. 25% of 12 would be 3. Now here's a trickier one. 75% of 16. Well, let's think of quarters. What's 1/4 of 16? 4. But I have 75%, not 25%. So I'm just going to multiply that by 3 to get the 75%. So that's going to be 12. Okay, this next part's a little bit trickier, but still we can do this. So what about 15%, 35%, 45%, and so on? Well, to find 5% of a number, we just need to find half of 10%, right? So we can use 10% and 5% of a number to find these types of percents. Because if 15% is made up of 10% and 5%, isn't 35% 30% plus 5%? 45% is 40% plus 5%, and so forth. So let's do this next part. Okay, I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit until we get the hang of it. 15% of 40, that's 10% plus 5%. Okay, so 10% of 40 is 4, plus 5% is going to be half of that 10%, right? And half of 10% would be 2. So 15% is 6. Okay, this next one, 40% of 20. Okay, well, 40%, that's 10% times 4, right? Times 4. Plus, I'll have my 5%. Okay, it's okay if you're not getting this, but I just want to show this to you. So what's 10% of 20? 2. Okay, but then it's not just 10%, it's 40%. So I would do 2 times 4. Plus, what is 5%? 5% is half of 10%. What was 10%? 2. So half of 2 is 1. So that's going to give me 8 plus 1 equals 9. Okay, 15% of 120. That's going to be 10% plus 5%. Okay, that's a lot easier. So 10% of 120 is 12. Plus 5% is half of 10%. So half of 10%, that's half 12, is 6. So that's going to be 18. Okay, don't freak out if you're completely lost. It's okay. This is just skills I want you to try to be able to do. I'm not going to make you do this on a test. like do it in your head. I just want you to try this, okay? All right, 35% of 80. Okay, I'm going to try to go slow and break this down. 35% of 80, that's 30%, right? Plus 5%. So that's like 10% times 3 plus 5%. Okay? So first of all, what's 10% of 80? 8. Okay, if 10% is 8, what is 5%? 4. Okay, and then I'm multiplying 10% times 3, so I'm going to multiply that by 3. So that's 24 plus 4 is 28. Okay, this next one, 65% is 10% times 6, right? Plus 5%. So I'm going to figure out 10% first. 10% of 60 is what? 6. So if 10% is 6, 5% would be 3. Now I'm going to multiply the 6 times 6 because I wanted 60%, not just 10%. And I'm going to get 36 plus 3 is 39. Okay, 35% of 40. That's like 10% times 3. That gets me my 30% plus 5%. Okay, so I need to know what is, I know something times 3, right? I need to know what's 10%. So 10% of 40 is 4. So if 10% is 4, 5% would be half of that, which is 2. So I have 4 times 3 plus 2. So that's 12 plus 2 is 14. And again, if you don't understand, it's okay. I do want you to be able to find like 10%, 50%, and 25% for sure. But the ones with the 5s on the end like this, that's okay. But I hope you at least kind of get an idea of how to do this, just for real life purposes. All right, see you later.